The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 3. The Small Man. Chapter 2. The Democratic State and its Monopoly of Indirectness. In Part 1, the term revolution was defined in a sense that gave it the widest interpretation. And indeed today it has to cover more things than most people suppose. Revolutionary is, as I said, a sensational, reverberating word. But it applies to many of the most respectable things already officially established amongst us. Much recent Tory and Liberal legislation is as revolutionary as any Sovietic enactments, only, as it occurs under an ostensibly old-fashioned parliamentary regime, it is not recognized as such. The spectacular violence of the Reds or Communists attracts our eye like a fiercely gesticulating puppet. Meanwhile, the Tory legislator is quietly drawing up, behind a heavy, respectable, official screen, communist measures, also anti-communist measures. His left hand imposes on the nation a communist measure, his right hand signs a decree consigning a batch of communists to prison. In the press of all parties we have a close-up only of his right hand, covered with capitalist jewelry, with exquisitely manicured nails. All these automatic hands, whether painted red or painted white, are doing the work of revolution, in the sense of that radical spiritual revaluation to which we are all committed. What is this revolution that can take here one form, there another, that is as far removed from the primitive humanitarian notion of the rising and reigning of the sans-culotte as it is from that of a limited bourgeois brotherhood, that does not aim merely at a passing revenge of the unfortunate on the fortunate, but envisages rather the purification and ordering of the world from top to bottom? That it is not my task on this occasion to show. I have set out only to clear a little space in the midst of the ruins of our society, where a few of the advantages of the future society, that everything so clearly prognosticates, and whose outlines, in the aspirations of a few political thinkers, artists, and scholars, are distinctly seen, can be enjoyed by those who care to avail themselves of certain facilities here specified. But in order to arrive at this slight clearance, it is necessary to some extent to give an answer to that question. The political ferment expressed by the fierce opposition of the principles of democracy or liberalism on the one hand, and dictatorship on the other, resolves itself into the secular question of the one and the many, of a unification of the world or of a plurality of control, of the rule of the minority or the majority, ruled by a show of hands or ruled by the most vigorous and intelligent. On one side and the other there are many schools of thought. Some, for instance, believe that a vast staff of people should be maintained to live parasitically on and exploit the stupidity of the general mass. Others are of opinion that things can work out in such a way that half the world can take in the washing of the other half, and that mutually these two sleepy halves can live, and sleep, on each other. Another school of thought contends that very gradually this mass can be wakened to a sense of responsibility, but that under no circumstances must it be brusque. This is the school to which Kautsky, MacDonald, Russell, etc., belong. Frederick the Great of Prussia, that famous ruler, thought that in condescending to rule, with the assistance of his heyducks and grooms, he had gone as far as could be expected of a man of his caliber. There is a story that he astonished someone attempting to represent him as a kind and much-loved father of his people, by suddenly and dramatically delivering himself of the following quotation. Qui est moi l'humain que j'ai trop su connaître? Méritant peu, monsieur, condé n'être leur maître. That snub expressed his sentiments more truly than his treatise Anti-Machiavel. Henry IV of France can be regarded as an early ideal liberal, certainly one of the greatest. He also represents the highest reach of Gallic statesmanship. He was as humane, tolerant, and rational a ruler as it is possible to get, in combination with great vigor. He never revenged himself, he was at once thrifty, and fond of life, he was a courteous, just, and amiable prince, and he was, of course, stabbed in the stomach at last for his pains. Machiavelli showed, and no one has ever been able seriously to dispute it, that government must be carried on, and can only be successful, if the nature of the governed is thoroughly taken into account, and regarded extremely coldly in an extremely matter-of-fact way. The citizens of Plato's Republic are hypothetic, they do not exist, but are optimistic phantoms of philosophy, and you cannot make bricks without straw. Yet his republic is humanly desirable, if there is any sense in the word humanly, since there are so few creatures who answer the description. In this way it is inevitable that you should arrive at the notion of the will of the greatest number, the dogma of what the public wants. What the will of the greatest number may be is consequently the capital question of statesmanship. And it is discovered, at first with a certain surprise, that nothing that can properly be called will exists for anything except a series of things that can conveniently be catalogued under that famous catchword, what the public wants. These resolve themselves into a simple series of disconnected appetites. But far more than this has always been forced on people, a luxurious, hypothetical surplus. As a result of the dogma of what the public wants, and the technical experiences of the publicist, a very cynical and unflattering view of what the public is widely held today. And, indeed, the contemporary public, corrupted and degraded into a semi-imbecility by the operation of this terrible canon of press and publicity technique, by now confirms its pessimism. It has learnt to live up to, or down to, its detractor. So in speaking of the public we must speak of that sad product of publicity that we see around us. It is inevitable that men who had escaped or resisted the general dementia should, surveying the fruits of liberal enlightenment and press control, at last formulate a counter-doctrine. Why turn yourself into the eternal servant of an imbecile, they then exclaim, or, in the Christian idiom, of the halt and the blind, or condemn yourself to teach the alphabet in an infant class forever. Why not rule? Would not that be simpler? That is the natural reaction of the best contemporary statesmanship to the fruits of what the public wants. Having arrived at this point, we are confronted with two figures, who remark that it is not worthwhile to rule men, and that all rule is evil, respectively. The first is excellently symbolized by Frederick the Great, who proceeds, of course, to rule men as they have seldom been ruled before. The second would be symbolized by Count Tolstoy, who did not believe in authority. He considered that no man should have power over another, and that authority in itself is evil. It is this second type of man to which the Soviet rulers especially object, for he is casting contempt on what they regard, rightly, as their predestined function, namely, to be rulers, men organizing and legislating for human beings as they are, not as they should be. They cover with scorn, in consequence, the intellectual who does not wish to stain his lily-white hands with such a sordid thing as power. Power, they say, is good. As to Frederick the Great, they would have more sympathy with him. But it is unlikely that they would regard it as essential, as he did, to shed tears after a battle on beholding the destruction for which he was responsible, or to protest, as Frederick did, how much he disliked governing, how distasteful the cruel things to which, because, alas, he was a ruler, he was committed were to him. On the contrary, with a peculiar candor they express their will to rule, their delight in power. And here we reach a point that must often have been observed by anyone surveying at all intelligently the duel of communism and capitalism, of fascism and democracy, of the East and the West, for it is roughly that. It is a paradox of that situation that all the frankness is on one side, and that is not on the side of the West, of democracy. All the traditional obliquity and subterranean methods of the Orient are, in this duel, exhibited by the Westerner and the democratic regime. It is we who are the Machiavels, compared to the Sovietist or the fascist, who makes no disguise of his forcible intentions, whose power is not wrapped up in parliamentary humbug, who is not eternally engaged in pretenses of benefaction, who does not say at every move in the game that he is making it for somebody else's good, that he is a vicar and a servant when he is a master. It is true that he promises happiness to the masses as a result of his iron rule. But the iron is not hidden, or camouflaged as Christian charity. He says that one politics in a country, one indisputed government, will be for the good of the average man. And when these one-party states are centrally organized, as Italy is becoming, who can gainsay him? This contrast of directness and indirectness was very patent during the war. The undiplomatic, un-Machiavellian frankness of the German method of war appeared to the Anglo-Saxon consciousness, so used to make believe, as diabolical. What the German was direct about, or much that Fascismo or the Soviet is direct about, is extremely barbarous. But much that Western democracy is indirect about is barbarous as well. All I wish to emphasize is a new factor, a political openness and directness, the initiative in which democracy cannot claim. Russian society for 50 years before the revolution was painfully confused, dragged this way and that by its liberalism and mysticism, as the great Russian writers witness. The Sovietic power has put an end to all that painful confusion as though by magic. The means were terrible ones. The Bolsheviks did not believe in gradualness and biologic growth, perhaps, enough. Many of the means taken to create the new state are no doubt susceptible of infinite improvement. And the most difficult task of any real, that is, powerful and severe, form of government is to reconcile the requirements of authority with the personal initiative that is impatient of rules, and which yet must not be crushed unless you wish to rule machines, not men. Nothing on earth today can overthrow such powers as the Soviet or Fascismo. The Sovietic or the fascist chiefs, like other people, have to do the best they can with the material to their hand, and they are not perfect themselves. What they have done in a short time in the way of organization must be the admiration of the world.